ever was throughout all of history. Well, what we've gone through so far is briefly a complete history of mankind, with the gaps left by official historians filled by means of the light thrown into these dark places by the Oriental tales. And is there some likeliness of a line of uniformity interlacing the histories of all ages in a consequent and logical way? And are there any difference between today's UFOs and the giant birds and magic carpets of yesterday? Or are they just called something different in ancient times? And what are they here for? To teach us what our science is still unable to find out, even to dream about? And why do they come? And why don't they contact us? Are they afraid of being burned at the stake? Well, today we have different weapons. Are they coming to warn us about the dangers of playing around with things beyond our control? Or perhaps to monitor us for our carelessness? And as an Arab of the times of Harun al-Rashid would say, only God is the wisest and can differentiate between what is real and what is not real. Read the 1001 Nights if you're interested in some interesting history. Things like this. A girl here opening the wall clove asunder, and the damsel appeared, clad as before and holding the rod. Right out of the 1001 Nights. And in the meantime, it would be useful for modern mankind to become more familiarized with many of the old stories about Jinn. Might learn that visitors from elsewhere are not to be feared necessarily because they're different. They're often friendly when not received in a hostile way. They could be of great help to those whom they consider as friends. And so ends Ladonke's observation on the 1001 Nights. And at this point, let's examine some related ideas that you'll probably never get from any history books you pick up. In the distant and dim past of the Mid-East, there were some of the most advanced and stable governing systems in all of history. There were several dynasties that lasted longer than the British Empire and the U.S. of America to date. And the Sumerians and Semites of Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Babylonia, they all borrowed the best of their laws and cultures from earlier cultures. These had been destroyed in the cataclysmic earth upheavals. And the famed Atlantis, of course, was the primary example of this. And the earlier gods of Sumeria eventually lost their immortality, as did those of later Egypt. Researchers of our time consider the numerous writings and records on this immortality issue as another groundless myth. Well, such truths are seldom recognized by materialistic skeptics. And persons who tap the so-called Akashic records tell us that the ancient records are usually correct. And a number of the early gods did rejuvenate themselves periodically. And according to these very unorthodox views, a representative of the Creator eventually came and took the powers of these early gods and moguls away because they misused their power. And this tale is covered to some extent in another incredible inquiry series called the Earth Report. And here we see some of the retinue of the servants that were butchered and sent in the tombs with the dead kings to attend them in the next world, which was a later unfortunate event that came up after the kings lost their power of rejuvenation. A barbarous practice, a custom. And kingdoms like Ur rivaled Egypt's later and earlier kingdoms, and the gods had complete control. Here we see a lady in the court of the great days of Ur. And Christians may find it interesting that this messenger we spoke of, or representative of the Creator, was called the Windy One, which is translated Holy Ghost. Leaders on the planet at that time called him thus, and Solomon was one of his descendants. It's best that we leave this subject to another presentation, however, and go on into the Mideast, because the Arab language, for instance, has changed little in the last several thousand years due to the high esteem Muslims have for the original language of the Quran. The northern dialects are similar to the Aramaic, which was widely used in the Middle East at the time of Christ. Arabic poetry has always been found and famed, but it simply cannot be translated to retain much of the flavor and beauty that's in the original tongue. Well, 1001 Nights is full of the works of two outstanding poets who wrote during the Abbasid age of some 750 years A.D. And civilization since then have crumbled. These works have remained, and they're still beautiful in their original tongue. And the culture in the Mideast, these areas, was filled with advanced works on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics and alchemy. Back then, Europe borrowed heavily from this knowledge to overcome her own medieval ignorance. And here's a Cairo University, which has changed little over the years. Later, of course, the Mongol invasions and Turks dried up the literary flow from the Mideast, and it never really recovered again. The advanced Arabian cultures came from the survivors of Atlantis during this occupation of Lower Egypt. Euclid's geometry books, for example, were originally Aramaic. Many of the great Muslim palaces are mathematical works of art. And Christians are seldom aware that Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness in Genesis. And the Prophet Muhammad instructions on visiting Mecca are closely tied in with these biblical events. And the pillars of faith of a Muslim center around prayer and being charitable, and fasting occasionally, and hopefully visiting Mecca as a pilgrim. Here we see some of the visitors near Mecca, thousands yearly. And here we see pilgrims on the Mount of Mercy. It was here that their traditions tell that Adam rejoined Eve after the fall. Many of these rituals and traditions are tied right into Christianity. Well, due to the periodic floods or cataclysms that occur, the surface area and temperate zones of the Earth have changed many times. And in the Mideast area, the deserts of today were once the fertile areas of great advanced settlements, according to the traditions. And H.P. Lovecraft had access to ancient records or knowledge and filled his strange tales with mention of many of the larger antediluvian cities. Aram, the city of 1,000 pillars, was typical, and it was long buried beneath the Gobi deserts, along with the legendary Shambhala. And according to Oriental legends, There were a number of impressive cities that correspond to those mentioned in the Arabian Nights, and some feel these were colonies of Mu or Atlantean empires of ancient times. And in Jeddah, a Mecca seaport, there's still a little-known museum there that contains hundreds of artifacts from these pre-Islamic periods. Researchers, Muslims of that area, and all outsiders are forbidden access to these ancient artifacts. The same secrecy exists, usually with private collections of records and writings scattered much over the East and Asia, private families, little-known monasteries and temples. They don't want outsiders meddling. And the so-called Holy Grail was a very ancient manuscript that could supposedly reveal the secrets of the gods and the ancients and bring the bearer power. Many felt it was still held in some private collection in the Mideast. Well, according to the most ancient tablets and later Egyptian papyruses, the Homo sapiens species is unique among all other animal forms. We humans not only have a soul and a body like animals, we have a very special force that allows us to evolve towards godhood. Our human minds feed good and unethical or evil thoughts both to our brain. And instead of acting on instinct, we must act in choice. It's conscience that's the mouthpiece of the soul. No matter how long it takes, the materialistic lusts must give way to more spiritual and ethical soul-balanced actions. Alfred B. Glazier, who wrote his Modern Human Comprehension text in the mid-70s, said the same thing and detailed exactly how the special minds came into being and could be balanced to perform so-called miracles like some of the spiritual leaders could perform. Glazier, like many others before him, claimed to recall former lives on the planet thousands of years ago and told of many of the ancient records, why they existed. He said that many persons who had not balanced their various components by the turn of this century would eventually lose some of these components and go back and return to an animal instinct level, going back to the pre-Adamic state, so to speak. James Churchward was a very unique writer that had other things to say about the ancient world, and he was from the 20s. He did his whole series of books on the ancient motherland of mankind. And his book, The Lost Continent of Mu, and other titles were very popular and have been read probably more than any other works in this area of interest. Churchward spent time in India and chanced upon what he called the Mythological tablets there. And these were symbolic records which were written in the ancient motherland. They eventually wound up in India. And here we see some examples, the hieroglyphics, the symbols. And the second group of tablets, later discovered in Mexico, also were written in the ancient alphabet of Mu. And some of the tablets gave an account of creation, another detailed history of the earliest man. They told of an ancient and very advanced culture on a continent somewhere north of the Hawaiian Islands. Lemuria, or Atlantis. Ancient times. And what are they here for? To teach us what our science is still unable to find out, even to dream about? And why do they come? And why don't they contact us? Are they afraid of being burned at the stake? Well, today we have different weapons. Are they coming to warn us about the dangers of playing around with things beyond our control? Or perhaps to monitor us for our carelessness? And as an Arab of the times of Harun al-Rashid would say, only God is the wisest and can differentiate between what is real and what is not real. Read the 1001 Nights if you're in. And is there some likeliness of a line of uniformity interlacing the histories of all ages in a consequent and logical way? And are there any difference between today's UFOs and the giant birds and magic carpets of yesterday? Or are they just called something different than it ever was throughout all of history? Well, what we've gone through so far is briefly a complete history of mankind, with the gaps left by official historians filled by means of the light thrown into these dark places by the Oriental tales. Interested in some interesting history. Things like this. A girl here opening the wall clove asunder, and the damsel appeared, clad as before and holding the rod. Right out of the 1001 Nights. And in the meantime, it would be useful for modern mankind to become more familiar